In the winter of 1934, onlookers stood frozen in the biting cold of West Albany to witness a rebirth. Indeed, they came for a glimpse of a machine that looked less like a traditional steam engine and more like a gleaming silver bullet. This was the Commodore Vanderbilt, and in its day, it represented a radical new defiance, one in which the smooth, sweeping lines of modern art refined the raw power of the industrial age, offering Americans a statement of proof that, as far as the New York Central was concerned, high-speed locomotives were still the future, even though most of the industry insiders already knew that diesel or electric locomotives would one day come to dominate the modern world. And so designers furthered this illusion by providing passengers with a rolling masterpiece of Art Deco luxury, a world of recessed lighting, brushed metal fittings, and the delicate upholstery that turned any journey into a status symbol. And yet, that dream would turn out to be about as thin as the mask that the train wore, in an attempt to trick the public into thinking that its otherwise standard Hudson boiler was the future of a rapidly changing technological world. So how did the physical embodiment of 1930s optimism end up as little more than a lost footnote in the history of American rails? And what was life really like on board this luxurious train? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover the fascinating story of New York Central's legendary Commodore Vanderbilt. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. This story really begins in the early 1930s, when the American railroads were facing a true existential crisis. You see, leading up to all of this, the industry had faced a brutal series of events. First of all, the Great Depression had snapped the nation's wealth, degrading basic rail maintenance in the process. And although they could have recovered from all of that, the rise of the automobile and then early commercial airplanes suggested that within the next few decades at best, the world as people knew it was about to be transformed. Now, in that context, for the New York Central Railroad at least, the ornate but smoke-belching giants of the Victorian era had begun to feel very outdated. And industry leaders knew that before long, the public would also start to see steam engines as relics of the past. Let's face it, they were dirty, slow, and uncomfortable. Well, by comparison, the future was supposed to be clean, or at a minimum, appear to be that way. Remember, as we've discussed at length in other videos, this is the time when Art Deco emerged as the aesthetic of progress, a promise of escape through beauty and confidence through innovation. And to be fair, the civilized world really needed both of those things. So by 1933, the shift wasn't just happening in architecture or art, it had reached the executive boardrooms of the most influential industries of the day. So it's not surprising that for railroad leaders like those at the Central, these cultural values were a practical solution to a grim marketing reality. For they saw the writing on the wall. If trains were to survive, they had to be more than just transportation. Actually, they had to be an experience. And once that realization set in, the New York Central acted fast by commissioning the engineers of West Albany shops with an impossible goal. Their objective was to make a locomotive that seemed fit for a ride to the stars, and that dream would become the Commodore Vanderbilt. Once the New York Central had approved this radical proposal, the project moved quickly. The plan was to take Hudson number 5344, the pride of the fleet, and completely encase it in a custom, futuristic-looking streamlined casing. Though, ironically, some engineers feared that the added weight of the casing would hamper performance, or perhaps worse, that the enclosure would actually increase the risk of the engine overheating by trapping the immense thermal energy of the boiler inside a unnecessary cosmetic casing. Allow me to elaborate. So basically, a steam locomotive worked by using heat from burning fuel, usually coal or wood, to turn water into high-pressure steam, which provided the force to move the entire train. Now, inside the actual boiler, the fire heated the water until it turned into steam, at which point the steam went right into the cylinders where it pushed the pistons back and forth. That made the sound we all know. The pistons were connected to rods that turned the locomotive's driving wheel, converting the steam pressure into mechanical motion. Then, After pushing the pistons, the steam was released through the smokestack, which created that iconic look I've used on so many thumbnails for these videos. But here's my point. If the fire got too hot, the steam ran dry, this whole thing could actually explode. Hence, a solution was found in the K School of Applied Science in Cleveland, where scale models were subjected to rigorous wind tunnel testing. Their target was ambitious here. They aimed to reduce air resistance by double-digit percentages at speeds exceeding 70 miles per hour. Now, what always fascinates me about projects like the Commodore Vanderbilt is that the train was designed long before computers, meaning that the designers had to hold entire systems in their head before ultimately committing it to paper. And we're talking about complex challenges like route planning, grades, mechanics, and economics. In other words, to accomplish their goal, they required unbelievable discipline and the art of thinking. And that mindset is actually why I teamed up with Supernote, the sponsor of this video, as their minimalistic device has changed everything about the way I work. So here's one real-life example on how I've been using this. I'm writing a script about the Commodore Vanderbilt steam train, and I thought what better environment to do it than an actual historic train museum. And so I can sit here, contemplate, and capture my raw ideas into a device that's not going to distract me. But at the same time, I do have the connectivity needed to pass the raw data into other systems that we use to create these videos. So it is really the perfect solution in my case, and I believe that if you do creative work, or even if you do business work or anything else that requires deep thinking, this would be a solution for you. I should also add that the Supernote screen works perfectly in direct sunlight, and I was delighted by how reliable the battery was, despite the fact that when I was filming this, it was a freezing cold day. So I'm proposing that you try something new by clicking my link in the description and adding this powerful tool to your workflow as well. Thank you, Supernote, for making this episode possible. But now, back to our story. By 1934, crews were ready for implementation, and the transformation process began at the West Albany shops. Workers there didn't just add a shell, they streamlined everything they could, from the sandboxes to the piping and even the tender. The result was this seamless, gunmetal gray colossus, and with that, the Commodore Vanderbilt became the new face of New York Central's marketing blitz. The railroad realized that if they named the engine after their founder, Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt, they could link the reliability of the 19th century Gilded Age with the speed of the 20th century. And so on December the 27th, 1934, the engine was officially unveiled to a stunned press, and it instantly became an icon of sorts. From there, the locomotive was dispatched on a massive exhibition tour across the entire system, where thousands of people lined the tracks in cities like Albany, Buffalo, and Chicago, all eager to see the promise of a faster tomorrow. And soon enough, the train entered regular service. And it did so as New York Central's premier runs, most notably the 20th Century Limited. And here's the important takeaway. On a PR level, the first assignments proved that streamlining worked. For example, on the water level route between New York and Chicago, the engine hauled heavy passenger trains newfound efficiency, maintaining schedules that left competing railroads in the dust. That success led to a surge in passenger confidence as the company maintained an aggressive promotional strategy. Internal records from the mid-1930s show how the Central used Vanderbilt's image on everything from menus to travel posters, branding it as the pinnacle of American industrial achievement. And let me tell you, as fascinating as the engine was from the exterior, the real shock came when you stepped inside. Although initially unveiled with standard Pullman cars, the locomotive would come to pull some of the most impressive carriages in the country, particularly with the later 20th Century Limited designed by Henry Dreyfuss. Inside the train, the Central had curated an atmosphere of a high-end Manhattan hotel. The vestibules were flush with the car bodies to eliminate wind noise, whereas the interiors featured a symphony of machine-aged materials such as brushed chrome, leather, and exotic wood, though the lighting is what really set the mood, as it was indirect, glowing from hidden coves to create a mood of quiet, effortless power. Then there was the dining car, where the tables were set with heavy silver and fine china. Travelers could enjoy multi-course meals while the Hudson hammered across the Mohawk Valley at 80 miles per hour. Though the lounge car was the social heart of the train. It featured deep cushioned armchairs and large observation windows that would turn something like a passing landscape into a kind of fixture of living art. But the most dramatic flourish was the sense of total enclosure. Remember, unlike those drafty, soot-spewing trains of the past, the Vanderbilt's cars were some of the first to be fully air-conditioned, a measure which insulated passengers from the noise and the grim of the steam era. In other words, this train service had effectively turned the brutal labor of long-distance travel into a refined social event, and for many years, it served as the preferred premium service. However, those golden years, well, they were not going to last. For all the attention that it commanded over the years, the Commodore Vanderbilt train was never going to last. At best, it bought the railroad company time. Even by the late 1930s, the limits of the experiment were starting to become clear. And surprisingly, the issue all started at a somewhat cosmetic level. Basically, the locomotive's fully enclosed streamlining, while visually striking, introduced practical problems that were no longer justifiable, particularly because routine inspections and maintenance were more complicated than dealing with a conventional engine. In short, panels had to be removed to access components that crews were used to accessing directly on other locomotives. So, for a railroad built on a tight schedule, even these modest inefficiencies mattered to their bottom line. Furthermore, at the same time, the broader context was also starting to shift, as other railroads were adapting cleaner, lighter designs, often with just partial shrouding that improved airflow but without sacrificing accessibility. With that in mind, the New York Central took note and began refitting locomotives to feature exposed driving wheels, simplify maintenance, and at the same time offer a modern aesthetic. At this point, the concession was to try and balance function with form, and it almost seemed that that compromise would last. But even when they settled the maintenance issues, they had to deal with some PR problems. You see, in 1938, a catalyst for change occurred when another streamliner, the Mercury train, which you might remember from the previous video, was stalled on the main line, and the Commodore, operating behind it, rounded a curve and was unable to stop in time. Despite emergency braking, the wet rails and limited visibility left the crew little margin. That collision injured dozens of passengers and damaged both streamlined trains, not only in form but in reputation. And we should also emphasize here that the accident was not unique to the Vanderbilt, nor was it caused by the design. But public opinion mattered, and when the railroad's two most celebrated streamliners were suddenly associated with the notion of danger, the company feared that the resulting decline could be in ticket sales. Remember, the industry leaders were still thinking ahead at this point. To be fair, it was the prime age of streamlining, and the crash wasn't the direct reason for its decline. Rather, it exposed a reality that the executives already understood. Streamlining couldn't overcome other physical limitations of things like the era's signaling, braking distance, and human reaction times. Even so, the streamliner was repaired and returned to service, but things would never be the same. As the 1940s approached, the looming demands of global conflict shifted the railroad's focus away from image and towards pure reliability. When the U.S. entered World War II, railroads were pressed into nonstop service, with durability and ease of maintenance as their top priority, not appearance. And so it was. In 1945, the New York Central made a practical but rather sad decision. The streamlined casing was removed, revealing the more traditional engine beneath it. Luxury passenger perks were also phased out around this time as diesel-electric locomotives began reshaping the industry. Hence, the final iteration of the Commodore Vanderbilt was retired from active service in 1953, just sold for scrap shortly thereafter. As for steam engines, well, they'd linger on in New York Central for a few more years in other forms until finally bowing out entirely in 1957. Today, little more than photos remain, and I must confess that I, for one, admire the beauty and imagination of that past time. In fact, I found myself wondering what a passenger from the 1930s would think if they had suddenly found themselves on the modern equivalent. I somehow suspect that they'd be a tad underwhelmed by the experience, from the food to the overall philosophy of what travel has become. But perhaps I'm wrong about that, and if I am, you can correct me in the comments section below. Otherwise, until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.